9 years on air, and by the time it ended, almost none of the original family remained standing exactly where they started. That's the strange, quiet truth about the Waltons that most fans never fully absorb. It wasn't cancellation that hollowed out the cast over time. It was a slow, painful series of personal decisions, health crises, and one death that the show never fully recovered from. The series that promised American audiences warmth, faith, and the comfort of a family that stayed together no matter what was behind the cameras, a story of people who couldn't stay, for reasons that had nothing to do with ratings and everything to do with the fragile, complicated lives of the actors who built it. When the Waltons premiered on CBS in September 1972, nobody in the industry expected it to survive. It was a soft, unhurried drama about a Depression-era Virginia family, adapted by Earl Hamner Jr. from his own childhood and from his earlier novel, Spencer's Mountain, at a time when television was leaning hard into gritty realism, spin-offs, and fast-paced sitcoms. Critics assumed audiences wanted escapism laced with cynicism. Instead, viewers wanted John Boy's narration, wanted Grandpa Zebulon Walton's stubborn wisdom, wanted the ritual of goodnight calls echoing across the dark farmhouse at the end of every episode. The show became appointment television, then a cultural institution, then something almost sacred to millions of households. But sacred things are not immune to real life, and real life came for this cast early and often. The first major departure, and still the one most people ask about, was Richard Thomas, the actor who gave the show its beating heart as John Boy Walton, the eldest son, an aspiring writer whose voice narrated every episode. Thomas won an Emmy for the role in 1973 and became, for a period, the face of the entire franchise. Yet after the 1976-77 season, his fifth on the show, Thomas chose to leave. The reason wasn't scandal or conflict with producers. It was, by his own repeated public explanation over the decades, simply the math of a young father's life. Thomas and his first wife, Alma Gonzalez, welcomed triplets in 1978, following an earlier daughter, which meant he suddenly had 4 children under the age of 2. He has said in interviews over the years, including retrospectives tied to Walton's reunion specials, that continuing the grueling episodic television schedule while raising newborn multiples felt physically and emotionally unsustainable, and that he wanted to pursue film and theater work that offered him more control over his time. CBS did not want to lose him. The producers restructured storylines to write John Boy out gradually rather than kill the character off, sending him to New York to pursue his writing career, which conveniently mirrored the actor's own pivot toward more prestige-driven acting roles. It was, in hindsight, one of the more graceful exits in television history, but it left a wound in the show's identity that the writers spent years trying to patch, first with a recast John Boy played by Robert Whiteman for the final 2 seasons, an attempt that fans never fully embraced the way they had embraced Thomas. If Thomas's departure was voluntary and carefully negotiated, the loss of Will Geer was neither. Geer played Grandpa Zebulon Walton, the crusty, philosophical patriarch whose scenes with Ellen Corby's Grandma Esther anchored much of the show's gentle comedy and moral center. Geer was, by the time the Waltons cast him, already a legendary and complicated figure in Hollywood history, a stage-trained actor and outspoken leftist who had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era for refusing to name names before the House Un-American Activities Committee. That blacklist had cost him film and television work for over a decade, and landing the role of Grandpa Walton in his late 60s was, by many accounts including retrospective interviews with his surviving family, one of the great professional redemptions of his life. He died on April 22, 1978, at his home in Los Angeles, from respiratory failure, following complications that some sources trace to a long battle with illness that he had largely kept private from the public. His death was not a plot twist producers engineered. It was a real, sudden absence that forced the writers to retire the character of Grandpa Walton within the show's fictional world as well, giving him a dignified off-screen death that mirrored the loss the cast and crew were genuinely processing. Ellen Corby, who had worked alongside Geer for 6 seasons by that point, reportedly struggled with his death in ways that colleagues later described as deeply personal, given how close the 2 actors had become playing an old married couple on screen. Corby's own story is, in some ways, the most quietly devastating of the entire ensemble. In 1976, 2 years before Geer's death, Corby suffered a serious stroke that left her with significant speech difficulties and partial paralysis. For most actors, that would have been a career-ending event. Full stop. But Corby, by every account from producers and co-stars in the years since, fought to come back to the role that had already earned her 3 consecutive Emmy Awards. The Waltons writers made a decision that was almost unheard of for the era. Rather than recast Grandma Esther or write the character out permanently, they incorporated Corby's real recovery into the storyline, having Grandma Walton suffer and slowly recuperate from a stroke on screen, using Corby's actual halting speech and physical limitations as part of the performance itself. It was a remarkable, unusually honest choice for network television at the time, and it meant Corby continued appearing on the show in a reduced capacity through much of its run, even as her health remained fragile. She would later suffer additional strokes in the years following the show's cancellation and eventually passed away in 1999, but her determination to return to Walton's Mountain after 1976 remains one of the more quietly heroic footnotes in. Michael Earned, who played matriarch Olivia Walton and won 4 Emmy Awards for the role, left under circumstances that were entirely her own choice, and she has been unusually candid about her reasoning in interviews over the following decades. By the later seasons, Learned felt the character had become static, a stabilizing, endlessly patient mother figure with fewer and fewer opportunities for real dramatic range as the show settled into its established rhythms. She has spoken publicly, including in interviews tied to televised Waltons retrospectives, about wanting to avoid being permanently typecast as the mother for the rest of her career, a fear that plagued many actors on long-running family dramas of that era. Learned's exit was handled within the show's storyline by having Olivia Walton contract tuberculosis and be sent to a New Mexico sanitarium for treatment, a plot device that removed her from most episodes during the 1979-80 season, while still technically keeping the character alive and eventually allowing for guest appearances. She returned periodically before the show ended, but her full-time presence on Walton's Mountain was effectively over years before the series finale, a decision she has framed not as regret, but as a necessary act of professional self-preservation for an actress who went on to build a substantial career in theater and other television roles well into her 80s. Beyond these headline departures, the show's ensemble of Walton children experienced their own quieter exits and reduced roles as the series aged. Judy Norton, who played eldest daughter Mary Ellen, and Mary McDonough, who played Erin Walton, both grew from child actors into young adults over the show's 9 seasons, and both have spoken in later interviews and podcast appearances about the strange pressure of maturing publicly inside a show built around wholesome, unchanging Americana. McDonough, in particular, has been candid in interviews and her own memoir-style public statements about struggling with body image issues and disordered eating during her teenage years on the show, pressures she has said were amplified by network expectations about how a wholesome, young actress should look on camera. A difficult reality hiding underneath a series so publicly associated with moral simplicity and family values. John Walmsley, who played musically inclined son Jason Walton, stayed with the show for its full run but has discussed in retrospectives how the demands of playing a character for nearly a decade, from adolescence into adulthood, blurred the line between his own identity and the role in ways that took years to untangle after the cameras stopped rolling. Even Ralph Waite, who played family patriarch John Walton and remained one of the show's most consistent presences throughout its run, was not immune to the pull away from Walton's Mountain. Waite left temporarily during production in the later seasons to direct and act in other projects, and producers had to adjust storylines to accommodate his character's absences, sending John Walton away on building or work trips that echoed, in fictional form, the real scheduling conflicts happening behind the scenes. Waite, an ordained minister later in life who ran for Congress in California multiple times after his acting career, has spoken about how the show shaped the rest of his public identity in ways he didn't always choose for himself, being permanently associated in the public mind with a fictional father, even as he pursued a much more restless, varied set of ambitions in reality. What emerges from all of these individual stories, when placed side by side, is not a picture of a cast that fell apart from conflict or scandal, the way so many other long-running shows from that era eventually did. There was no public feud, no tabloid scandal driving people away from Walton's Mountain. Instead, what the Waltons cast experienced was something more universal and, in its own way, more affecting: the simple, unglamorous reality that life does not pause for television production schedules. Richard Thomas needed to be present for 4 newborn children. Michael learned needed her career to grow beyond a single defining role. Ellen Corby needed to physically relearn how to perform after a stroke most actors would never have returned from. Will Geer, a man who had already survived professional exile once in his life, did not get to choose the timing of his own death. Every departure, examined honestly, traces back not to Hollywood ego but to the ordinary, unavoidable pressures of aging bodies, growing families, and the simple passage of time, the very themes the show itself spent 9 seasons gently, patiently exploring on screen. There is something almost unbearably fitting about that. The Waltons was always a show about impermanence disguised as permanence, about a family that endured hardship, war, poverty, and loss while insisting, episode after episode, that love and home could hold everything together. Behind the cameras, the people playing that family were living out a much more ordinary version of the same truth. They aged. They got sick. They had children of their own who needed them more than a soundstage in Los Angeles did. They wanted careers that didn't calcify around a single character forever. And when the cameras finally stopped rolling for good in 1981, what remained wasn't a cast that had betrayed the spirit of the show by leaving it. It was a cast that had, in its own fractured, human way, lived out exactly the values the show always tried to teach. That family endures, even when its members cannot all stay in the same room forever. That love outlasts absence. That saying goodnight to someone, even from far away, still means something. Decades later, surviving cast members have continued to gather periodically for reunion specials and interviews, revisiting Walton's Mountain not as strangers, but as people bound by something that outlasted contracts and shooting schedules. Richard Thomas has returned for retrospectives. Judy Norton and Mary McDonough have spoken openly and with clear affection about the family they built off-screen even as their on-screen family scattered across new projects. And when longtime fans ask why so many beloved faces disappeared from the show they loved, the honest answer isn't a tale of betrayal or industry cruelty. It's simply this: they were never fictional Waltons forever. They were real people, growing older,